The apartment carried the particular emptiness of a place never meant to become home. Neutral walls absorbed what little morning light reached through windows overlooking a parking lot where Sarah Mitchell's 10-year-old Honda sat among cars that looked equally temporary. Cardboard boxes lined one wall, still taped shut after 3 months, their contents chosen not for comfort, but for the ease with which they could be low-loaded again when the lease expired. At 46, she had learned to pack lightly, to avoid attachments, to treat every address as something that would soon require abandoning. Emma slept on an air mattress in the corner, 9 years old and already accustomed to waking in rooms that felt borrowed. Her backpack leaned against the wall, stuffed with school supplies purchased from discount bins, the straps frayed from use that predated this city, this apartment, this particular chapter of impermanence. Sarah watched her daughter's chest rise and fall, with the steady rhythm of sleep that came easily to children who had learned not to ask when things would get better. The bills spread across the kitchen table told their own story. Credit card statements stacked 3 deep, each one a monument to decisions made when employment had seemed permanent and marriage had promised partnership. $23,000 on one card alone, the interest compounding monthly like a slow hemorrhage. Legal fees from the divorce added another $18,000, and medical bills from Emma's bout with pneumonia the previous winter contributed 4 more. $45,000 in debt, and the unemployment check that arrived twice monthly delivered $1,680 that disappeared before it could be properly counted. She had been a project manager once, the kind of consultant companies hired to untangle complex logistics and coordinate teams across time zones. That version of her life had included a house with a mortgage, a husband who left for someone younger, and the illusion that competence guaranteed stability. The company had folded 6 months after the divorce finalized, taking her severance package with it into bankruptcy proceedings that would drag on for years. Now she worked retail part-time, stocking shelves and operating registers, the kind of labor that kept her moving but paid barely enough to justify the gas money. Emma stirred, blinking against the gray light filtering through thin curtains. Her voice came soft, trained by experience not to expect too much from mornings. "Is today better?" Sarah manufactured a smile that felt like lifting something heavy. "Getting there, sweetie." Breakfast consisted of generic cereal that turned milk gray, powdered substitute because the real thing cost too much, and bread from the day-old rack toasted until the staleness vanished under char. Emma ate without complaint, a resilience that broke Sarah's heart more thoroughly than tears ever could. The girl had learned to accept what was offered, to express gratitude for things that should have been baseline rather than gift. Madison's mom said she can give me her old winter coat. Can I take it? The question landed like an accusation Sarah hadn't earned but couldn't escape. Madison wore new coats, Emma wore inherited ones, and even that generosity required accepting charity from mothers who pitied what they saw. "That's very nice of Madison's mom. Tell her thank you." The mail arrived through a slot in the door with the mechanical precision of bills seeking payment from accounts that held nothing to give. Sarah gathered the envelopes without enthusiasm, sorting past credit card offers designed for people whose credit hadn't already collapsed, and advertisements for services she couldn't afford. One envelope stood out, heavier stock than the rest, embossed with a law firm's letterhead that suggested expense beyond her reach. The language inside maintained the careful distance of legal prose, words chosen to convey information while disclaiming any emotional stake in their content. During the digitization of early 20th century land and housing records, an unclaimed patent document had been identified. The document concerned a residential structure built during the frontier period and legally registered under the name Margaret Mitchell, deceased 1985. The record had never been delivered to its intended recipient and had therefore remained inactive for more than a century. According to current law, as the next verified descendant, Sarah Mitchell was being notified of its existence. She read the letter twice, then a third time, convinced that some crucial detail had escaped her attention. A house, a patent, her grandmother. The combination felt unreal, assembled from elements that didn't belong in the same sentence. Family stories about Margaret Mitchell had been sparse to the point of deliberate, reduced to adjectives that suggested judgment rather than affection. Stern woman, unusual, lived far from others, built something with her own hands. No one had spoken of ownership or documents or official recognition. The explanation unfolded across a second page. Bureaucratic archaeology revealing how silence could persist across generations through nothing more consequential than institutional failure. The patent document had been sent in 1898 through a regional postal office that later closed due to financial collapse. Records indicated that several sacks of undelivered mail were stored, moved, forgotten, and eventually lost as offices merged and jurisdictions shifted. During recent archival consolidation, one such sack had been discovered in a warehouse scheduled for demolition. Inside were hundreds of documents, most obsolete. This one remained legally valid. A century of silence because someone had misplaced a bag of mail. Sarah felt something sharp and bitter rise in her chest, anger at the casual way institutions could alter lives through their failures. How many inheritances had dissolved into rumor because paper failed to reach its destination? How many claims had expired in storage while families invented stories to explain absence? Emma peered over her shoulder, curiosity overcoming the learned caution of children who had seen their mother struggle. "What's that, Mom?" "Maybe nothing. Maybe a house." The word house transformed Emma's face, imagination racing ahead of probability toward a possibility that felt like rescue. "A house? Like we could live there?" Sarah forced herself toward realism, toward the deflation of hope before it could grow large enough to hurt. "I don't know yet. It's very far away." That evening, she searched through the family records she had carried from apartment to apartment, documents that felt more like archaeological evidence than living history. Birth certificates recorded facts without context. A few photographs captured moments stripped of meaning by time and the deaths of everyone who could have explained them. One yellowed newspaper clipping announced her grandfather's passing in language so formal it might have been describing a stranger. Margaret Mitchell appeared in only one image, a figure standing beside a structure so narrow and tall it looked like an architectural mistake. The photograph had degraded past clarity, its edges eaten away by decades of storage in conditions that hadn't considered preservation. But the building behind her grandmother was unmistakable, even through the blur of age and damage. 3 stories compressed into a footprint that seemed to defy structural logic. Walls rising with severe economy, roof pitched sharply against the sky that had faded to white. Even in the ruined image, something about the house suggested refusal, a quality of having been built to withstand rather than accommodate. Emma studied the photograph with an intensity that reminded Sarah of her own younger self, before life had trained her to expect disappointment. "She looks tough." People said she was stern, unusual. "What does that mean?" "I think it means she didn't fit in, did things her own way." Emma considered this, turning the idea over with the seriousness children bring to concepts they're testing against their own experience. "Like you, Mom." The comparison surprised Sarah into something close to laughter, though the sound came out wrong, more recognition than humor. "Maybe." The map attached to the letter unfolded into coordinates that made no sense according to modern geography. Hand-marked lines suggested a region somewhere along the Wyoming-Montana border, terrain marked largely blank on current maps. No roads crossed the area, no landmarks provided reference beyond a notation for a dry riverbed and a phrase that read, "former settlement," in handwriting that predated standardized fonts. According to GPS satellites and digital cartography, the location was uninhabited, the kind of empty space that planning commissions viewed as available for future development precisely because history had already vacated it. Sarah called her mother from the library's free phone, unwilling to burn through her cellular minutes on a conversation she already knew would offer no support. Linda Hayes had spent 70 years cultivating practical skepticism, the kind that came from surviving disappointments by expecting nothing better. Her voice carried the flat affect of someone who had learned not to waste energy on enthusiasm. "Margaret, why are you asking about her?" "I got a letter about property, a house." "Your father's grandmother was strange, Sarah. Lived in the middle of nowhere. When she died, nobody claimed anything because we assumed there was nothing to claim. The letter says there's a legal document, a house that's been standing since 18. If it exists, it collapsed decades ago. Don't waste your time chasing fairy tales when you need to find real work." "What if there's value, even just the land?" "Then someone would have claimed it already. Use your head." The call ended the way most conversations with her mother ended, with Sarah feeling simultaneously chastised and misunderstood, and Linda feeling justified in her pessimism by a daughter who kept making impractical choices. Emma had heard everything from across the small apartment, her expression carefully neutral in the way children learn to protect their parents from knowing how much they understand. Grandma thinks it's dumb? Grandma's careful, that's all. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep clutching the stuffed bear that had survived 3 moves and showed signs of needing a fourth, Sarah sat with the bills spread around her like evidence at a crime scene. Debt, $45,000. Savings, $280. Next month's expenses, $2,100. Income, $1,680. The mathematics allowed no ambiguity. This could not continue. She looked at the letter, at the photograph, at her daughter sleeping on an air mattress because a real bed was too expensive and too heavy to move. Her first instinct was to dismiss the entire matter, to sign whatever papers would close the claim and let the property return to bureaucratic obscurity. But the thought of doing so produced an unexpected sense of loss, as though she would be turning away from something that had waited far too long to be acknowledged. By morning, the decision had formed without drama, settling into place like something that had always been inevitable. She would go, not to claim ownership, not to take possession, but simply to see, to stand where her grandmother had stood and confirm that the past described in legal documents had truly existed. It felt less like choice and more like obligation, as though the letter hadn't found her by accident at all. They left before dawn, Sarah and Emma loading the Honda with the efficiency of people accustomed to traveling light. Emma treated the departure like adventure, a road trip that promised novelty even if the destination remained uncertain. Sarah told herself this was verification, nothing more, a simple journey to confirm whether the place marked on the old map still existed. But beneath that practical reasoning lay a truth she couldn't quite articulate, a pull towards something she couldn't name. The Highway West offered familiar rhythms at first. Gas stations appeared at predictable intervals. Trucks maintained steady speeds in designated lanes. Service plazas provided bathrooms and vending machines that dispensed calories at prices calculated to extract maximum profit from captive audiences. Emma played the road trip games children invent to pass time, counting license plates from different states and inventing stories about the families inside passing vehicles. But gradually, without any clear boundary marking the transition, the world thinned. Signs became infrequent, their messages reduced to distances that seemed less like promises and more like warnings. Town names disappeared from overhead boards. Gas stations grew farther apart, then vanished entirely, leaving stretches of empty highway where breakdown would mean waiting for strangers to provide rescue. The road itself narrowed, its surface rougher, patched with repairs that suggested maintenance deferred rather than prevented. Sarah's phone lost signal without ceremony. One moment it displayed time and weather. The next it showed only blank indicators, acknowledging that it had no authority here, no connection to the networks that made it useful. She placed it face down between the seats, aware that from this point forward, whatever happened would not be easily shared or recorded. Emma noticed the loss of connectivity with the alarm children raised on screens experienced when their devices stopped performing magic. No service? We're really out in the middle of nowhere. The landscape opened into wide, exposed stretches where the horizon felt too distant and the sky too large, as though the normal proportions that govern the world elsewhere had been abandoned in favor of something more severe. Old fence lines leaned at angles that suggested surrender, their posts half buried by wind and time. The wire rusted into fragile threads that would snap at the slightest pressure. Once they passed the remains of a house reduced to its outline, roof collapsed inward, windows gone, the whole structure sagging like something the land had grown tired of holding upright. Emma's earlier enthusiasm gave way to a quieter mood, the kind that came from recognizing that some adventures involve more emptiness than excitement. It's so empty. Yeah. Sarah followed the map with increasing difficulty as the road degraded from pavement to gravel to something barely distinguishable from the surrounding terrain. The Honda protested with sounds that suggested mechanical suffering, its suspension groaning each time the wheels encountered irregularities that would have been smoothed away on roads that received regular maintenance. The car had carried them from Ohio through states that at least pretended to care about infrastructure, but this final stretch demanded more than it was designed to provide. The failure came quietly, a sharp vibration, a loss of power, then nothing. Sarah coasted to a stop and sat with her hands resting on the wheel, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, feeling no anger and no panic, only a dull recognition that this had been expected all along. The air outside felt colder than she had anticipated, cutting through her jacket with the kind of chill that promised worse to come. Silence pressed against her ears, broken only by wind moving across dry grass in patterns that sounded almost like speech. Emma climbed out with visible nervousness, looking around at emptiness that offered no obvious path forward. What happened? Sarah checked the car with the perfunctory gestures of someone who already knew the diagnosis. Something broke. Can't fix it here. What do we do? Sarah consulted the map one final time, measuring the distance between their current position and the coordinates that marked her grandmother's land. House is only a few miles. We walk. Emma's eyes widened with the kind of alarm that came from children raised in cities where walking meant sidewalks and crosswalks, not wilderness that stretched beyond sight. Walk with our stuff? Just what we need. They began with Sarah carrying a backpack that held water, the legal documents, and Emma's stuffed bear, while Emma managed a smaller bag with snacks and the jacket she would need when temperature dropped further. The ground revealed itself as deceptively difficult, uneven in ways that demanded constant attention. Each step required acknowledgement, as though the land insisted on being recognized before granting passage. Emma struggled but didn't complain, her boots slipping occasionally on loose stone, forcing pauses to catch breath that came harder as fatigue accumulated. The farther they walked, the more thoroughly isolation pressed against them. No paths suggested recent movement, no signs indicated human presence, only wind-shaped grass and the occasional cry of a bird whose species Sarah couldn't identify. Doubt accompanied each step like a shadow that grew longer as the afternoon progressed. She questioned the map's accuracy, her own judgment, the wisdom of bringing her daughter into terrain that offered no guarantees. More than once Sarah stopped, turning slowly to measure the emptiness around them, wondering whether they had already passed the point where turning back would have been wiser. Emma watched her mother with the careful attention children develop when they sense adult certainty beginning to fracture. Then, without warning, she saw it. At first it appeared as a vertical interruption against the horizon, a shape that violated the land's horizontal language. As they drew closer, the form resolved into walls, narrow and tall, rising where nothing else stood. The house matched the photograph with a precision that made Sarah's breath catch. 3 stories compressed into a slender footprint, proportions that seemed almost defiant of structural logic. The walls, built from compacted earth and straw, bore the marks of time but showed no signs of collapse. The wooden roof, weathered dark by decades of exposure, still held its sharp angle against the sky. Emma stopped beside her, voice dropping to an awed whisper. "Mom, it's real." "Yes, it is. It's so tall and skinny, like it refused to fall down." They approached slowly, details emerging with each step, the thickness of the walls uneven but deliberate, small, narrow windows placed high, positioned to conserve warmth rather than provide views. A single chimney rising from the roof, blackened by use but unbroken. Sarah felt no sense of trespassing, no guilt about entering property that might not legally belong to her. Instead, she felt as though she had arrived at a place that had been waiting, that had maintained itself across decades specifically for this moment of recognition. The door resisted when she pushed, wood swollen by years of exposure. When it finally opened, the sound echoed sharply in the quiet air, announcing their presence to a structure that had known only silence for longer than Sarah had been alive. Emma hesitated at the threshold, looking to her mother for permission to enter something that felt sacred despite its abandonment. "Should we go in?" "It's ours, or might be." Emma took her hand, and together they stepped across into air that dropped noticeably cooler. The smell hit immediately, earth and old wood and dried straw combining into a scent that suggested something built from the land rather than merely placed upon it. Light entered sparingly through the small windows, illuminating dust that hung motionless, waiting for movement to disturb patterns that had held for years. They stood just inside, allowing their eyes to adjust and their hearts to slow. Nothing lay scattered, nothing suggested violent abandonment. The space felt instead like something that had been closed carefully and left to wait, maintained not by human hands, but by the simple durability of materials chosen for their ability to endure. Emma's whisper carried clearly in the stillness. It's like a museum, or a time capsule. The first level revealed its purpose through details that spoke more clearly than words. Shallow troughs carved directly into the compacted earth floor, their edges smoothed by repeated use. Hooks set into overhead beams, darkened with age. The floor itself bore marks of hooves, faint but unmistakable, pressed into dirt that had hardened into something approaching stone. Animals had sheltered here once, their bodies contributing heat that rose to warm the levels above, their presence a calculated necessity rather than sentiment. At the center of the structure stood the base of the stove, a column rising from ground level with walls thick enough to store heat and radiate it slowly. Sarah placed her hand against the cold surface and tried to imagine the warmth it must once have carried, traveling upward through the narrow spine of the house, distributing heat with the kind of economy that came from understanding exactly how much fuel could be spared and how many bodies needed warming. Emma examined everything with the focused attention of a child determined to remember details for later retelling. Animals lived here. On the bottom level, their heat would rise to meet. Emma's face showed the moment understanding clicked into place. To keep people warm upstairs. Exactly. They found the narrow stair pressed against one wall, its steps uneven but solid, each tread bearing a slight indentation at the center, where countless feet had worn the wood down over time. Emma climbed carefully ahead, the structure responding to their weight with sounds that suggested conversation rather than complaint. Sarah followed, one hand on the wall for balance, feeling the texture of earth and straw compressed into something that had outlasted everything around it. The second level opened into what had clearly served as the main living space. The ceiling hung low, forcing them to duck slightly, but the walls extended thick enough that the windows became slits carved deep into the structure. Light entered reluctantly, but with intention, falling across a room that still held evidence of the lives once lived within it. Simple sleeping platforms lined one wall, little more than raised frames that would have been packed with straw and covered with hides that had stiffened into leather-like rigidity over the decades. There were more platforms than Sarah expected, arranged close together in configurations that spoke of necessity rather than comfort. Emma counted them aloud, her voice carrying a note of discovery. 1, 2, 3, 6 beds. Families lived here together, shared warmth. A small table stood near where the stove column continued upward, its surface marked by cuts and burns that told stories Sarah couldn't interpret. Beside it rested a collection of bowls and cups, mismatched in size and material, some carved from wood, others shaped from clay, with the kind of crude functionality that came from making do with available resources. Nothing here matched because nothing had been acquired all at once. Each item represented something added when it could be spared, accumulated slowly against needs that couldn't wait for better circumstances. Emma picked up a wooden cup, holding it with reverence. People drank from this? A long time ago. Great-great-grandma Margaret? Maybe. Emma's attention shifted to the wall behind the sleeping platforms, her young eyes catching details that Sarah's older ones might have missed. She moved closer, running her fingers over marks carved directly into the hardened earth surface. Mom, come look at this! Sarah joined her daughter, pulse quickening as she recognized what Emma had found. Vertical lines measured and deliberate, some taller than others, arranged in sequences that track growth over time. Next to them were faint letters and numbers pressed into the wall with something sharp, creating records that had survived through nothing more than the durability of the medium. Names, dates, measurements of growth. Children had lived here. Children had grown slowly in a winter that had tried to stop time altogether. Sarah traced one of the names with her finger, the carved letters spelling out Thomas R., 1898, age 4. The name meant nothing to her, yet the intimacy of it struck harder than any artifact could have. Someone had taken time to record this, not for posterity, but because it mattered in that moment, because survival alone was not enough. Memory had to be preserved, even if only in mud and straw. Emma's voice came quieter now, weighted with understanding beyond her years. Did they all make it? Sarah saw other marks, names that ended without continuation, and she couldn't bring herself to invent comforting lies. I don't know, sweetie. Scattered among the functional objects were smaller things that spoke of attempts to maintain humanity when circumstances threatened to reduce existence to pure endurance. A toy carved from scrap wood, its edges smoothed by handling. A strip of cloth knotted into a crude doll. A piece of charcoal wrapped in fabric, protected as though it mattered. Emma picked up the doll, holding it with the gentle care children instinctively offer to things that belong to other children. They had toys. They tried to stay human, even when things were hard. Near the base of the stove column, Sarah found scraps of paper pressed between boards and walls, protected from drafts and moisture by people who understood what documentation might mean to those who came after. The paper had become brittle, the ink faded, but enough remained legible to reveal fragments of daily life. She gathered them carefully, spreading them where light was strongest. The writing showed uneven quality, sometimes hurried, sometimes painfully precise. No long reflections, no explanations meant for outsiders, just practical notations, counts of supplies, days marked with simple lines or crosses, temperatures noted in rough terms rather than numbers, short phrases repeated again and again. Still cold. No wind today. Burn less. Share more. One fragment stopped her entirely. A list of names, each followed by a mark. At first she assumed it recorded presents who remained in the house on given days. Only after reading further did she understand. The marks indicated who still slept on the platforms each night. Where a name ended without a mark, there was nothing else written, no commentary, no explanation. The absence was enough. She folded the papers carefully and set them aside, hands unsteady despite efforts to remain composed. This was not a story of heroism or dramatic struggle. It was quieter than that, more devastating. People had lived here knowing that not all of them would see the thaw, and they had chosen to endure together anyway. The voice came from behind them, male and unexpected, causing Sarah to spin with protective instinct that put her between Emma and whatever threat might materialize. Didn't expect anyone here. The man in the doorway looked to be in his late 60s, weathered in the way that came from years spent outdoors, wearing practical clothes and a tool belt that suggested he had come prepared for physical labor. His hands were raised slightly, a gesture meant to convey harmlessness. Saw dust when you opened the door. Came to check. Sarah's voice came out harder than she intended, sharpened by the surprise of discovery and the automatic defense of a mother with her child. We have legal claim to this property. Not here to challenge that, just surprised. He lowered his hand slowly. You're the granddaughter, Margaret Mitchell's. How do you know? Letter went to the county too. Historical records. I track these things. He took a step inside, moving with the careful deliberation of someone aware he was in another person's space. Name's Frank Reeves, retired park ranger, local historian, I suppose you could say. This house has been legend around here for years. Didn't think anyone would actually come. Emma emerged from behind her mother, curiosity overcoming caution. We drove all the way from Ohio. Frank's expression softened into something like approval. That's a long way. Brave kid. Sarah studied him, trying to decide whether his presence represented help or complication. He looked at the house the way someone might look at holy ground, with a respect that suggested personal connection rather than academic interest. You know about this place? My great-grandfather lived here. Died here, actually. Winter of 1898. The information settled over Sarah like something she should have expected, but hadn't. His name was Thomas Reeves, 23 years old, caught pneumonia during the coldest month. Emma gasped and pointed at the wall where growth marks were carved. Thomas R., that's him. Frank approached the marks, reaching out to touch letters his ancestor had helped carve more than a century earlier. His eyes held the particular sadness of someone confronting family history that predated memory, but shaped everything that came after. He was here, part of this. 7 families lived here that winter, Frank continued, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had researched facts but only now confronted their physical reality. 12 children, 4 didn't make it to spring. Sarah felt the weight of that number, the mathematics of survival rendered in lives that hadn't lasted long enough to see thaw. Margaret built this? She convinced them to pool resources, build vertical instead of spreading out. Smart woman, hard woman. Had to be. She'd lost her own husband 2 years before this winter, built this place in 4 months, organized the families, rationed supplies. My great-grandfather said she never slept, just kept the stove going, checked on everyone. They walked through the house together, Frank explaining the design with a builder's eye that recognized genius in what others might dismiss as crude construction. The animals on the ground floor, their body heat rising. The stove in the center radiating heat 360 degrees. The upper floor trapping the warmest air. The thick walls providing insulation they could harvest locally. The high, small windows minimizing heat loss while allowing enough light to prevent complete darkness. Emma followed along, fascinated by the technical explanations that transformed the house from mysterious artifact into comprehensible machine designed for a single purpose. She was like a scientist and an engineer, self-taught from observation and necessity. Sarah listened to Frank describe her grandmother, each detail adding substance to a figure that had existed only as absence and adjective. Family had never talked about Margaret except in terms that suggested they didn't understand her. Stern, unusual. These weren't criticisms, Sarah realized now. They were acknowledgments that Margaret Mitchell had operated according to principles the comfortable couldn't comprehend. Together they examined the scattered papers, Frank translating shorthand and dating references Sarah couldn't place. He found the phrase "still cold," "no wind today," "burn less, share more," and his voice caught slightly. That's Margaret's handwriting. My great-grandfather kept a diary too. Same phrases. They shared a moment of silence, acknowledging the connection between their ancestors that neither had known existed until this moment. Thomas and Margaret, trying to save each other, succeeding and failing in measures that couldn't be separated. While Frank and Emma continued examining papers, Sarah returned her attention to the wall near the stove, where something had caught her eye earlier. The texture differed from the surrounding surface, smoother and more carefully packed, as though someone had sealed this section with greater intention. She pressed her palm against it, feeling for hollow spaces, finding none but unable to shake the intuition that something waited behind the deliberately neutral surface. She worked carefully with a tool from her pack, testing rather than forcing, watching for signs that the structure would protest violation. The surface resisted, then yielded slightly, releasing a trickle of dust that smelled older than the rest of the room. Frank noticed her activity and moved closer, professional curiosity overriding whatever conversation he had been having with Emma. "What are you doing?" "This section, it's different." The seam emerged gradually as Sarah worked, revealing itself not as accident but as deliberate closure, sealed with patience and precision by someone who hadn't been in a hurry, but also hadn't intended for it to be reopened. When the opening widened enough to reveal contents, Sarah felt her breath catch with recognition of discovery that changed everything. Inside the narrow cavity lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth darkened and stiffened by age. Beneath it were additional items stacked carefully, each separated by layers of fabric and paper. The whole arrangement suggesting archive rather than hasty concealment. This was not treasure thrown together in desperation. This was documentation, preservation, evidence kept against a future that had finally arrived. Sarah removed the first bundle and unwrapped it slowly, revealing coins heavier than she expected. Their surfaces dulled, but unmistakably gold. More lay beneath, along with folded papers bound together with twine that crumbled slightly at her touch. Frank's low whistle carried through the quiet. Jesus, that was dangerous currency back then. Emma crowded close, eyes wide. "Is that real gold?" "I think so." The documents confirmed what the weight of the coin suggested. Deeds to land parcels, names crossed out and rewritten. Official stamps that had once carried authority but now seemed like threats frozen in ink. These were records of seizure attempts, government efforts to relocate families, claims that land belonged to people who had never worked it, while those who had built lives there were dismissed as squatters whose rights didn't matter. Frank read aloud from one of the documents, his voice tight with anger that reached across generations. "These are seizure orders, government trying to take the land for railroad expansion. They wanted everyone gone." More papers revealed purchase agreements at prices that insulted the value of what was being demanded, threats of forced removal if families refused to sell. Promises that sounded like extortion backed by the authority of distance and official seals. Sarah understood with the sudden clarity that sometimes came from seeing evidence rather than hearing stories. The gold had been pooled, gathered not for wealth but for leverage, a last defense against forced removal. Families had contributed what they could, creating a fund that might allow them to purchase land legally, to fight displacement with the same weapons being used against them. But using it openly would have drawn exactly the attention they couldn't afford. Officials would have confiscated it as proof of illegal accumulation or taxed it beyond value. So Margaret had hidden it, sealing it into the house itself, choosing survival over wealth, protection over profit. Frank spoke the realization aloud. This wasn't a fortune meant to be reclaimed. It was a sacrifice. Emma understood in the direct way children sometimes grasp what adults complicate with analysis. She gave up being rich to keep everyone safe. Exactly right, kid. They examined the papers more carefully, finding a list that made Frank go completely still. Family names with amounts contributed. Reeves family, 2 gold coins. Kowalski family, 1 gold coin. Silverbees Mitchell family, 3 gold coins. Frank sat heavily on one of the sleeping platforms, the weight of discovery pushing him down. Thomas Reeves, my great-grandfather, he was part of this. He was trying to help them survive. And he did, just not himself. Emma moved to stand beside Frank, placing a small hand on his shoulder with the instinctive compassion of children who recognize grief when they see it. He was brave. Yes, he was. Frank examined the growth marks again, running his fingers over the carved letters with new understanding. He helped measure these children. He taught carpentry. Margaret had the design but needed hands to build it. He was 23 years old and he built something that outlasted him by more than a century. Evening light was fading when they finally emerged from examining the house and its secrets. Emma had grown quieter with exhaustion, processing discoveries that exceeded her capacity to fully comprehend, but understanding enough to recognize significance. Frank looked at Sarah with an expression that combined question and challenge. What are you going to do with this? I don't know. The letter said I could claim it as inheritance. Claiming brings attention. Authorities, developers. This land is blank on modern maps because everyone wants it that way. Empty land is developable land. Sarah looked around at the house that had survived when everything else vanished, at the evidence of sacrifice preserved in gold and paper and carved names. Her whole life had been temporary by necessity and eventually by habit. But standing here, she felt something shift, a recognition that some things deserve permanence, even when permanence came at cost. The house should be protected. It's proof of something. Proof that people can survive when institutions fail them. That's not a message the government wants preserved. They stood in gathering darkness, Sarah and Frank and Emma, 3 people connected by ancestors who had tried to save each other across a winter that allowed no certainty of success. Frank broke the silence with a proposal that sounded like it had been forming while they explored. What if the gold funds something new? Something that continues what Margaret started? A shelter. Modern but built on the same principles. A place where travelers can survive winter. Sarah considered this, feeling the rightness of it settle alongside the enormity of what it would require. I can build it, Frank continued. I've got the crew, the skills. You've got the legal claim and the funding source. Emma took both their hands, her voice carrying conviction that surprised Sarah with its force. We can do it together. Frank looked at Sarah directly, offering partnership rather than charity. My great-grandfather died here believing he'd failed. He hadn't. Neither had Margaret. If this house gets a second chance to save people, that's completing something. Sarah thought about her temporary life, her rootless existence, her inability to commit to places that wouldn't commit to her. She thought about Emma sleeping on air mattresses and wearing borrowed coats and learning to expect disappointment. She thought about Margaret building upward when resources limited, building outward, about choosing community over individual survival, about sealing gold into walls rather than claiming wealth that would attract destruction. I've been running my whole life. Maybe it's time I stood still. They shook hands as darkness completed its claim on the landscape. sealing an agreement that would require everything Sarah had and more besides. Frank warned her honestly about what waited ahead. "We're going to have a fight. Officials won't like this." But Sarah had already decided, and Emma's grip on her hand made the decision feel less like risk and more like inevitability. The house had survived by answering a question Winter kept asking. As long as Winter returned, the answer needed to remain available. Some buildings were meant to be lived in. Others were built to respond to necessity that transcended individual ownership. She understood now what had pulled her here across miles in mechanical failure and the collapse of everything that had once provided structure to her existence. This wasn't about inheriting property. It was about continuing work that her grandmother had started and that her grandmother's companions had died supporting. The gold would fund the shelter. The shelter would honor the house. The house would stand as evidence that survival sometimes required building together what couldn't be built alone. They returned to Frank's truck as full dark settled, Emma falling asleep against Sarah's shoulder during the drive to the nearest town. Frank promised to return the next day to begin planning, to start assembling what they would need to build something that honored what Margaret had created while meeting the demands of a new century. Sarah watched the landscape pass in darkness, knowing that the journey she had thought was ending had actually just begun, and that the temporary life she had lived for so long was about to become permanent in ways she couldn't yet fully imagine. Frank drove them to the nearest town through darkness that made navigation feel more like faith than science, the truck's headlights catching stretches of empty road that all looked identical. Emma slept against Sarah's shoulder, exhausted by discoveries that had transformed a long shot into something approaching destiny. The motel Frank recommended advertised rates by the week, its neon sign flickering with the irregular pulse of electrical systems that needed repair but would probably never receive it. The room cost $42 for the night, a price that felt extravagant given Sarah's remaining budget, but unavoidable given the lack of alternatives. She counted what remained after paying, $98 between her and complete financial collapse. Emma woke enough to brush her teeth and collapse onto one of the twin beds, still wearing her clothes, too tired to care about protocol. Sarah sat at the small table and performed calculations that grew more desperate with each iteration. Money left, $98. Gas to get home, roughly $60, assuming the car could be repaired cheaply, which seemed unlikely given the sounds it had made before dying. Food for the return trip, $20 minimum. That left $18 against expenses she couldn't yet predict, but knew would materialize. The mathematics allowed no room for optimism. Her phone, reconnected to civilization's networks, buzzed with notifications accumulated during days without signal. Most were automated reminders about bills she couldn't pay. One, however, came from an unfamiliar number with a local area code. The message contained a single line requesting her presence at the county land office in 3 days for a mandatory meeting regarding her claim. Mandatory. The word carried implications Sarah recognized from experience with bureaucracies that wielded procedure as weapon. Someone had moved quickly, much faster than government typically operated, which meant someone with authority wanted to address her claim before it could gain traction. She texted Frank, who responded within minutes. "That was fast. Someone's paying attention. I'm coming with you." Sarah spent the next morning at the public library, using free computer access to research what she could about the region's recent development proposals. The search returned results that painted a clear picture. Multiple inquiries over the past 3 years, all from the same company, Whitmore Properties. Proposed projects range from luxury wilderness resorts to private hunting preserves, each pitched with language about economic growth and job creation, while carefully avoiding mention of the historical settlements that had once occupied the land. The most recent proposal, dated 4 months earlier, included architectural renderings of a high-end retreat center, promising wealthy clients authentic frontier experiences without actual frontier discomfort. The planned location corresponded almost exactly to the coordinates where Margaret's house stood. Someone had been preparing for this land to become available, had perhaps even been waiting for the patent document to surface so they could make an offer before anyone else understood what existed. Emma spent those 3 days exploring the small town with the fearless curiosity of children who hadn't yet learned to recognize danger. She befriended a dog that belonged to the motel owner, discovered a creek that ran behind the building, and reported each small adventure to Sarah as though they constituted major expeditions. The normalcy of it, the simple pleasure Emma took in temporary freedom, made Sarah's chest tighten with recognition of how little her daughter had been given to enjoy. On the morning of the meeting, Sarah dressed in the closest approximation of professional clothing she owned, items purchased years ago when client presentations had been part of her work. The fabric had worn thin at the elbows and the style had aged past current fashion, but they represented an attempt at authority she hoped might matter. Emma wore her school clothes, the ones without visible stains or holes, and brushed her hair with unusual care. The county land office occupied a building that looked like it had been constructed during an era when government architecture aspired to dignity through columns and stone facades. Time and deferred maintenance had reduced those aspirations to peeling paint and cracked steps, but the structure still managed to project bureaucratic permanence. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed with a particular frequency that induced headaches, and beige walls absorbed what little natural light penetrated windows that hadn't been cleaned in recent memory. The receptionist directed them to a conference room on the second floor, offering no additional information beyond the room number. Sarah climbed stairs that creaked under minimal weight, Emma's hand gripping hers with increasing tightness as they approached whatever waited above. Richard Dalton rose from his seat at the conference table when they entered, extending his hand with the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to first impressions mattering. His suit cost more than Sarah's monthly rent, tailored to emphasize shoulders and minimize a midsection that suggested sedentary prosperity. Everything about his appearance communicated success in terms that measured value by financial accumulation rather than personal accomplishment. Ms. Mitchell, I've reviewed your inquiry regarding the patent document. His eyes took in Sarah's worn clothing, her tired face, Emma's backpack with its frayed straps, and something shifted in his expression, a subtle calculation that measured them against standards they had already failed. This is quite irregular. Patent documents from 1898 rarely surface after such extended dormancy. The letter said it's legally valid. Technically, yes. Practically speaking, the situation proves far more complex. He gestured for them to sit, though he remained standing, using the height differential to establish hierarchy. Emma looked up at him with the direct stare children employed when they sensed adult dishonesty. Do you have any idea what you're asking to claim? The land in question has been administratively vacant for over a century. Even if a structure once existed there, which I frankly doubt, weather and time would have eliminated it decades ago. The house is standing, we saw it. Dalton's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise, or might have been annoyance at having his assumptions contradicted. You traveled there? With your daughter? Across terrain without proper roads or services? We managed. Miss Mitchell, let me be frank. You drove here from Ohio, if I understand correctly, with your child, clearly not a woman of substantial means. The assessment landed like accusation disguised as observation, each word chosen to remind Sarah of her position relative to his power. My point is that claiming this land initiates a legal process you cannot afford. Surveys, environmental assessments, title searches, property taxes owed retroactively. We're discussing $15,000 to $30,000 in fees before you could even take possession. Sarah felt the number hit like physical impact. Knowing her visible reaction confirmed everything he already assumed about her financial situation. However, I can save you that trouble. The county is willing to offer a settlement. $5,000. Sign over any claim today and walk away with money that could address your obvious difficulties. He slid an envelope across the table, its thickness suggesting the check inside had already been prepared, waiting only for her signature to become real. Emma's voice came quiet but clear. That's not very much. Dalton's smile tightened at the edges. It's more than the land is worth, dear. Your mother's situation requires practical thinking. His gaze returned to Sarah, loaded with implications about single motherhood and financial desperation and the wisdom of accepting help when offered. $5,000 could make a real difference for someone in your position. Sarah looked at the envelope, at Emma, at Dalton's face arranged in an expression of false concern. The offer was designed to sound generous while insulting the value of what was being demanded. More importantly, the speed of it, the preparation, suggested he knew something about the land's actual worth that he had no intention of sharing. I'd like to see the property first. Do proper research. There's nothing there to research, Ms. Mitchell. You're wasting time and resources you clearly don't have. Then you won't mind if I look more carefully. Dalton's expression hardened into something closer to his actual feelings. The land is 60 miles into wilderness. No roads, no infrastructure, no services. You plan to make repeated trips out there with a child? Emiya sat up straighter. I'm a good explorer. This is foolish. You're gambling with stability you desperately need on property that has no value beyond what I'm offering. Sarah stood, pulling Em up with her. My offer expires in 48 hours. After that, you navigate the legal process alone, and I assure you it will not be pleasant. They reached the door before he called after them, voice carrying the edge of someone unaccustomed to being refused. Ms. Mitchell, when you find yourself unable to proceed, don't expect a better offer. This was generosity. What comes next is simply law. Sarah didn't respond, keeping her pace steady until they reached the parking lot where Frank waited in his truck. He read the outcome on her face before she spoke. He tried to buy you out? $5,000. Frank's laugh came bitter. That confirms it. He knows what's there, knows what it's worth. They drove to a diner that served breakfast regardless of the hour, settling into a booth whose vinyl seats had been repaired with duct tape that matched nothing. Emma ordered pancakes and focused on spreading butter with the concentration of someone trying not to listen to adult conversation that clearly mattered. Dalton's more dangerous than I expected, Frank began, keeping his voice low enough that surrounding tables couldn't overhear. Someone's watching, maybe listening devices at the house. How did he know about the cash? Someone told him, or he's got informants monitoring activity out there. Either way, he and whoever's behind the development plans are coordinating. They want that land badly enough to move fast. Sarah processed this, feeling the weight of opposition she hadn't fully understood when she'd first opened the letter. This wasn't bureaucratic indifference. This was active hostility backed by resources and authority she couldn't match. So what do we do? Frank leaned forward, lowering his voice further. We build the shelter first. Show that the house still serves its purpose. Make it real before they can stop us. Use the gold carefully, trace it through clean channels so no one can claim we're stealing historical artifacts. I'll assemble a crew, people who understand the mission. Is that legal? We'll file the paperwork. Won't wait for approval, but we'll document everything. Sometimes you ask forgiveness instead of permission, especially when permission would be denied for the wrong reasons. Sarah thought about Emma sleeping on air mattresses, about bills that exceeded income, about a lifetime of temporary arrangements that had taught her to expect displacement. Margaret had built upward when resources limited building outward. Maybe building fast when bureaucracy demanded waiting represented the same principle applied to different constraints. I've got $200 left. That won't even cover materials. The gold covers materials. I know someone who can help us liquidate it properly, quietly. A jeweler who doesn't ask questions that don't need answering. We'll have what we need. Emma looked up from pancakes she'd arranged into a smiley face. Can I help? Sarah started to refuse, to protect her daughter from whatever consequences might follow, but Frank spoke first. Smart kids make good documentarians. You'll record everything, every detail, every step. That's important work. Emma's face transformed with the importance of being given real responsibility. The following week passed in a blur of activity that felt simultaneously too fast and not fast enough. Frank liquidated 3 of the gold coins through channels he didn't fully explain, but assured Sarah were legitimate. The money appeared in an account he'd established in her name, substantial enough to fund construction, but modest enough not to attract attention from authorities who might question sudden wealth. He assembled his crew in a workshop that smelled of sawdust and machine oil, introducing them with the economical language of someone who valued competence over ceremony. Miguel Rodriguez, 52 years old and built like someone who'd spent decades working with stone, specialized in masonry that honored traditional techniques. Danny O'Brien approached carpentry with the enthusiasm of relative youth, 28 and still convinced that hard work led reliably to success. Lee Anderson brought 43 years of electrical experience and the skepticism of someone who'd seen too many projects fail to believe promises without proof. Frank explained the project in terms that emphasized practical challenge over emotional appeal. Shelter following 1898 design principles. Thick walls, central heat, community space, free for travelers who need it. Miguel's question came direct. Who's paying? Funding is guaranteed. Complicated source, but you'll get your wages on time. Danny looked uncertain. Building unlicensed shelter sounds like asking for trouble. It'll be licensed eventually, but people need it now. Winter comes early this far north, and it comes hard. We build before the first snow, get it functional, then handle bureaucracy after we've proven it works. Lee voiced the concern they all shared. What if officials shut us down mid-construction? Then we've built something anyway. Evidence matters more than permission when you're trying to establish that something should exist. Each man had reasons for agreeing that went beyond wages. Miguel had lost a brother to exposure 15 years earlier, a death that proper shelter might have prevented. Danny believed in Frank with the loyalty of someone who'd been mentored through difficult years. Lee was curious about historical building techniques and respected Frank enough to trust his judgment even when conventional wisdom suggested caution. They drove to the site in a convoy that looked like it had assembled for work rather than tourism, trucks loaded with tools and initial supplies. Emma rode with Sarah in the repaired Honda, chattering about everything she would photograph and document, treating the journey like adventure rather than risk. The crew's first sight of Margaret's house produced the reaction Sarah had come to expect. Silence, then movement toward it, drawn by the improbability of its survival. Miguel walked the perimeter with hands that touched walls as though reading Braille, assessing techniques that had been old when he was young. Compacted earth, straw reinforcement. Haven't seen this done properly in decades. He turned to Frank with something approaching reverence. This is master-level work. Self-taught, you said? Margaret Mitchell learned by doing, by observing what worked and what didn't. Danny examined the stove column with the focused attention of someone trying to understand principles he'd been taught were obsolete. Heat rises naturally, warms all three levels. No forced air, no electricity required. Lee stood at the entrance, looking up at the structure's impossible height relative to its narrow base. It shouldn't be standing, but it is. They spent hours exploring, Frank explaining the design choices that made survival possible during a winter that had killed hundreds. The animals on the ground level, the sleeping arrangements that prioritize warmth over privacy, the careful rationing of fuel. Emma showed them the growth marks, the carved names, the evidence of children who had measured their heights against walls that remembered. Miguel's voice came quiet. This is holy ground. Frank nodded. Yes, it is. They laid out plans for the new shelter adjacent to the old house, designing something that honored the original while incorporating improvements that modern materials allowed. Similar vertical emphasis to conserve heat. Wider footprint to accommodate more people. Thick walls using contemporary insulation wrapped in earth and straw to maintain the aesthetic and thermal properties Margaret had pioneered. Central stove updated with modern efficiency, but preserving the radiant heat principle. Sarah sketched alongside Frank, contributing ideas from her background, managing complex projects, translating his builder's knowledge into diagrams that could guide construction. Emma photographed everything, narrating into her phone like a documentary filmmaker, establishing context for future audiences. The logistics proved brutal from the outset. Materials had to be transported over roads that barely deserved the designation, with final delivery requiring manual labor across terrain that resisted wheels. Costs tripled compared to conventional construction sites with proper access. Weather cooperated initially, but everyone knew autumn in this region meant sudden storms that could shut down work for days. Sarah found herself hauling beams and mixing earth with straw, learning through exhaustion what blueprints couldn't convey about the physical reality of building. Blisters formed and popped and formed again. Her back ached in ways that over-the-counter medication couldn't address. Emma helped where she could, carrying tools and organizing supplies, with the seriousness of someone determined to prove she belonged. Miguel watched Sarah work with an expression that shifted from skepticism to approval over the course of several days. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do. Okay then, here's how you hold the trowel so your wrist doesn't give out after an hour. Early autumn rain arrived with timing that seemed deliberately malicious, turning the ground into mud that sucked at boots and made every step an exercise in resistance. Supplies got damaged. Timeline estimates extended. Frank studied weather forecasts with increasing concern. Winter comes early here. We're racing the calendar, and the calendar doesn't care about our intentions. They worked dawn to dark when conditions allowed, Frank pushing the crew hard but never asking more than he gave himself. Sarah watched him move through the construction site with the confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime solving problems through direct action, and she understood why his great-grandfather had followed Margaret's plan even when survival seemed unlikely. Emma documented everything, creating a record that would prove essential when authorities eventually arrived to question whether proper procedures had been followed. She photographed foundation work and wall construction and stove installation, narrating each stage with the vocabulary she'd learned from listening to adult conversations. This is the central heating column. Mr. Miguel is building it using techniques from 1898, but with modern fire-resistant materials that meet current safety codes. The principle is radiant heat distribution without forced air or electrical systems. The sound of vehicles approaching carried clearly across the empty landscape, announcing visitors long before they arrived. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as 3 official trucks pulled up, disgorging Richard Dalton, accompanied by 2 inspectors whose clipboards suggested they'd come prepared to find violations. Dalton's expression held satisfaction poorly disguised as concern. Unauthorized construction. This needs to stop immediately. Frank stepped forward, placing himself between Dalton and the partially completed shelter. We're on private property. Legal claim has been filed. Claim remains under review. Until resolved, no construction permits can be issued, and work conducted without permits constitutes violation of county ordinances. The inspectors moved through the site, marking deficiencies with the thoroughness of people executing instructions they'd received before arrival. No approved foundation plan, no electrical permits, no sewage system documentation. Each notation added to a list that would justify whatever action Dalton intended to take. Sarah forced her voice to remain steady. We're using traditional methods, minimal electrical needs, composting toilet system that requires no sewage infrastructure. The first inspector didn't look up from his clipboard. Still requires permits. Traditional methods don't exempt projects from current code compliance. Dalton produced a document with theatrical precision, handing it to Sarah with the care of someone delivering a weapon. Cease and desist order. You have 48 hours to halt all construction or face fines of $500 per day. Continued violation may result in structure demolition. Emma's voice cut through the adult tension with a clarity that demanded attention. You're a bully. Dalton turned toward her, expression shifting to something between surprise and condescension. Excuse me, young lady? You're trying to scare us. That's what bullies do. Your mother is making poor choices that affect your welfare. Emma stepped closer to Sarah, defiance replacing any fear Dalton's authority might have inspired. My mom is helping people, like my great-great-grandmother did. You're trying to stop her because you're mean. Dalton's face flushed with anger poorly contained. Control your child, Ms. Mitchell. Sarah placed a hand on Emma's shoulder, pride and protectiveness combining into something that felt like courage. She's right, though. You are trying to scare us. Dalton's veneer of professional concern cracked completely. This is your last chance to avoid serious consequences. Sign over the claim, take the settlement, and walk away before you destroy what little stability you have left. After they left, the crew gathered in silence that felt like group processing of a threat they hadn't fully anticipated. Danny spoke first, voicing what others were thinking. We could get arrested. Lee looked at the shelter's half-finished walls. Or fined into bankruptcy. Miguel turned to Sarah, expression unreadable. So what do we do? Stop? Sarah looked at Emma, who met her gaze with expectation that her mother would choose correctly. She looked at Frank, who waited for her decision without offering influence in either direction. She looked at the old house standing witness to this moment, Margaret's work enduring across more than a century of weather and neglect and institutional indifference. What did Margaret do when they threatened her? Frank's answer came immediate. She kept building. Then we do the same. Miguel's grin came sudden and fierce. Fuck them. He glanced at Emma. Sorry, kid. Emma's response arrived without hesitation. It's okay. He deserves it. The decision to continue despite official prohibition transformed the project from construction into resistance. They worked faster, pushing toward completion before enforcement could materialize. Danny brought in 2 additional laborers who asked no questions about permits or authorization. Lee rigged temporary lighting so they could work past dark. Miguel drove his crew with intensity that admitted no excuse for delay. Word spread through channels Sarah didn't fully understand, carried by the informal networks that existed parallel to official communication. A journalist named Amanda Price appeared one morning, camera in hand, and questions prepared about the construction dispute she'd heard about through sources she wouldn't name. Sarah's caution warred with recognition that media attention might offer protection that legal standing couldn't provide. What do you want to know? Why a state commissioner is trying to stop historical preservation. Why building a winter shelter violates codes that seem designed to prevent exactly what you're doing. After the shelter's finished, before they can shut us down. Come back then, and I'll tell you everything. Amanda's smile suggested she understood the strategy. I can work with that timeline. 6 weeks into construction, the shelter achieved basic functionality. Structure enclosed. Stove operational. Interior far from complete but adequate for its purpose. Not luxurious, not even comfortable by contemporary standards, but solid and warm and capable of keeping people alive when temperature dropped below the survival threshold. Emma had documented every stage, creating a record that proved the quality of materials and the skill of construction, even if official inspections had been bypassed. Her narration combined technical accuracy with emotional investment, explaining not just what was being built, but why it mattered. They stood together at the end of a long day, Sarah and Frank and Emma and the crew, looking at what they'd created beside what Margaret had built. The old house and the new shelter, separated by more than a century, but united by common purpose. Danny broke the silence with a question that felt more like acknowledgement. When do people start using it? Frank's answer came without hesitation. Now, anyone who needs it. Officially, we're not operational. Unofficially, the door stays unlocked and the fire stays lit. That night, the first guests arrived. 2 hikers caught by sudden snow that fell weeks earlier than predictions had suggested, saw the building and hoped it offered refuge. Sarah welcomed them with words that felt like inheriting Margaret's role. Come in, you're safe. They were grateful in the way people become when alternatives involve real danger. Their car had gotten stuck 2 miles back, phones dead, temperature dropping fast. Without the shelter, they would have faced a night that might have killed them. Instead, they slept in bunks designed for exactly this purpose, waking to warmth and coffee and stories about the house that had inspired the building that saved them. Emma recorded their names in a log she'd created, preserving memory the way Margaret had carved growth marks into walls. So we remember everyone great-great-grandma helped. Word spread quickly through invisible networks that connected travelers and truckers and people who worked in regions where infrastructure remained sparse and weather remained dangerous. Within a week, the shelter had housed 12 people whose situations ranged from inconvenient to life-threatening. Each expressed gratitude, each promised to tell others. The building became real through use before bureaucracy could determine whether it should exist. Dalton's return came with additional force, his vehicles accompanied by a sheriff's deputy whose presence announced that this had escalated beyond administrative dispute. The cease and desist order had been ignored. Fines were accumulating. Now came the threat of actual enforcement that might involve arrests or demolition or both. Sarah met them outside, positioning herself between officials and the shelter where 3 families currently sheltered from weather that had turned viciously cold overnight. Construction has ceased. The building is complete. Operating without full certification violates multiple codes. The structure must be vacated immediately. There are people inside who will die if they're forced back out into this cold. Dalton's expression held no sympathy. That's speculation, not fact. Regulations exist for public safety. Your feelings don't supersede law. The sheriff's deputy looked uncomfortable, his gaze moving between Dalton's certainty and the shelter where smoke rose from the stove, evidence of warmth that contrasted with temperature that had dropped below zero. Emma appeared in the doorway, her voice carrying across the space between officials and opposition. Great-great-grandma's house saved 50 people. In worse winter than this, we're doing the same thing. Dalton's patience fractured completely. This is final warning. Vacate the structure or face arrest for criminal trespass in operation of unlicensed facility. The sound of another vehicle approaching interrupted whatever response Sarah might have given. Amanda Price emerged with camera equipment in a determination that suggested she'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Her presence changed the dynamics immediately, transforming a confrontation that could have ended with arrests into a scene that would be documented and broadcast. Commissioner Dalton, can you comment on why you're attempting to close a shelter that's currently protecting families from life-threatening weather? This is not appropriate for media coverage. A dispute about public land and emergency shelter during winter conditions? That's absolutely appropriate for media coverage. Amanda turned her camera towards Sarah. Miss Swiss. Mitchell, can you explain why you built this shelter? Sarah felt the weight of the moment, the knowledge that her words would matter beyond this immediate conflict. My great-grandmother built a house that saved people when institutions failed them. During a winter that killed hundreds, 50 people survived because she understood that some things matter more than regulations. We're honoring that legacy. We're proving that survival still requires community and shelter and the willingness to act when action becomes necessary. Dalton's face flushed dark. This interview is over. But Amanda had already captured what she needed, footage that would transform local dispute into story about government preventing people from helping each other during dangerous conditions. The deputy sheriff watched this unfold with an expression suggesting he recognized that his role had become more complicated than simply enforcing an order. He spoke quietly to Dalton, words Sarah couldn't hear but whose impact showed clearly in how Dalton's posture shifted from aggressive to constrained. Whatever the deputy said apparently included recognition that forcing evacuation on camera while temperature remained lethal would create optics that couldn't be managed away. Dalton turned back to Sarah, voice tight with barely controlled fury. This isn't over. Winter doesn't last forever. When conditions improve, enforcement will proceed with full legal authority. By then, everyone will know what you tried to do. He left without responding, vehicles pulling away with speed that suggested retreat poorly disguised as choice. The sheriff's deputy remained behind briefly, approaching Sarah with an expression that combined sympathy and warning. Ma'am, he's serious. This will escalate. I'd recommend finding legal representation before it goes further. I'll do what I need to do. He nodded and left, and Sarah stood watching the dust settle behind departing trucks, feeling simultaneously victorious and terrified. They had won this confrontation, but Dalton's parting words promised that the actual battle remained ahead, and she had no illusions about her capacity to win a sustained legal fight against someone with his resources and authority. Inside the shelter, families who had witnessed the confrontation gathered around the central stove. Their presence evidenced that the building had already justified its existence, regardless of what came next. Emma moved among them with confidence, born from seeing her mother stand against power, and refused to yield. Frank pulled Sarah aside, voice low enough that others couldn't overhear. This gets harder now. He'll come back with more than threats next time. I know. Are you ready for that? Sarah thought about Margaret building upward when resources limited building outward, about hiding gold to protect community when using it openly would have attracted destruction, about making choices that prioritized survival over compliance with authority that served interests other than those who needed protection. I've been running my whole life. I'm done running. Rebecca Torres arrived at the motel 2 weeks after Dalton's confrontation, driving a sedan that had accumulated dents from parking in cities where space mattered more than appearance. She wore clothing that suggested courtrooms rather than construction sites, but her handshake carried the strength of someone who'd spent years fighting battles that couldn't be won through politeness alone. Frank had made the introduction through connections Sarah didn't fully understand, describing Torres as a civil rights attorney who chose cases based on principle rather than profit. She reviewed Amanda's footage on a laptop that looked like it had survived multiple moves and several near-death experiences, watching Dalton's confrontation with the practiced eye of someone cataloging evidence for future use. When the video ended, she sat back with an expression that combined satisfaction and calculation. This is winnable. Dalton overreached badly. His conflict of interest is prosecutable. Enforcing evacuation during lethal weather conditions creates liability the state won't want to defend. Sarah felt hope rise despite her trained skepticism about outcomes that sounded too favorable. I can't afford legal fees. Pro bono, I fight government overreach on principle. Bureaucrats who weaponize regulations to serve private interests make me angry, and anger is excellent motivation. Emma looked up from the homework she'd been pretending to complete. I like you. Torres smiled with genuine warmth. I like you too, kid. Want to be my paralegal? Take notes, observe proceedings, learn how the system works when someone actually fights back. Emma's face transformed with the importance of being given real responsibility in adult matters. Really? Absolutely. Every good lawyer needs someone keeping them honest. Torres filed motions that same afternoon, working from the motel room table with efficiency that suggested she'd operated in worse conditions. Immediate lift of the cease and desist order based on Dalton's documented conflict. Formal complaint against him for using public office to pursue private vendetta. Emergency petition for historical designation that would provide federal protection overriding county authority. Each document landed like ammunition in a war Sarah hadn't known she was fighting until it had already begun. Amanda's story went viral within 48 hours, amplified by networks that specialized in narratives about individuals standing against institutional power. The footage of Dalton demanding evacuation during sub-zero temperatures, while families sheltered inside, played particularly well on platforms that thrived on outrage. Support donations arrived faster than Sarah could process them, small amounts from hundreds of people who saw themselves reflected in her struggle. She redirected everything to homeless services and winter relief programs, unwilling to profit from attention that felt unearned. The court hearing took place 3 weeks later in a county courthouse whose architecture suggested optimism from an era when government buildings were designed to inspire civic pride. Time had degraded those aspirations without eliminating them entirely, creating spaces that felt simultaneously dignified and shabby. The gallery filled with locals whose interests suggested this had become entertainment as much as jurisprudence, and media whose presence transformed routine proceedings into performance. Judge Helena Morrison presided with the particular authority of someone who'd spent decades managing courtrooms, where emotion ran high and facts remained disputed. She reviewed Torres's motions with attention that suggested genuine consideration rather than perfunctory acknowledgement, then listened to the state attorney's defense with an expression that gave away nothing about her thinking. Torres argued with precision that avoided theatrical excess, building her case through documented facts rather than emotional appeals. Dalton's family history with the land, his financial connections to Whitmore Properties, the timing of enforcement that coincided suspiciously with Sarah's refusal to sell, the attempted evacuation during weather conditions that made compliance genuinely dangerous. Each point landed cleanly, supported by evidence that couldn't be easily dismissed. Judge Morrison's ruling came after a recess that felt deliberately calculated to build tension. The cease and desist order is lifted pending full review. Construction may continue, provided daily safety inspections are conducted and passed. Commissioner Dalton is recused from this matter effective immediately due to documented conflict of interest. However, Ms. Mitchell, understand that this ruling does not exempt your project from compliance with applicable codes. The replacement commissioner arrived the following week, a woman named Patricia Graham, whose reputation suggested adherence to procedure without the personal vendetta that had motivated Dalton. She inspected the shelter with thoroughness that acknowledged competent construction while noting deficiencies that would require remediation. Daily inspections became routine, transforming construction into performance art, where every decision faced immediate scrutiny. During this period, Emma began helping Miguel and Danny with small tasks, learning to carry tools correctly and organize supplies efficiently. Sarah watched her daughter grow more confident with each day, the tentative child from Ohio transforming into someone who understood that contribution mattered more than protection. The weather forecast for late November arrived with language meteorologists usually reserved for genuinely dangerous situations. Extreme winter storm approaching. Historic severity possible. Temperatures predicted to reach -20 Fahrenheit, with wind chills approaching -50. Duration estimated at 5 to 7 days of continuous conditions that would make travel lethal and outdoor survival essentially impossible. Frank studied the predictions with an expression that suggested he was measuring them against experiences Sarah couldn't access. This is serious. Worst I've seen forecast in 40 years. Worse than 1898? Maybe not quite that bad, but close enough that the difference won't matter to anyone caught outside. They accelerated final preparations, stockpiling firewood and food supplies and medical equipment against needs they hoped wouldn't materialize but couldn't ignore. People began arriving 3 days before the storm's predicted arrival. Travelers who recognized warning signs and chose to stop moving before movement became impossible. 6 hikers from a group that had underestimated autumn's capacity to transform into winter. A family of 3 whose vehicle had proven less reliable than GPS had suggested. A couple whose planned romantic weekend in wilderness had collided with reality that cared nothing for romance. Sarah organized sleeping arrangements and food rotation with skills developed managing corporate projects, discovering that coordinating shelter operations drew on the same competencies that had once coordinated teams across time zones. Emma moved among guests, recording names in her logbook with the seriousness of someone who understood that documentation mattered. Doris arrived accompanied by Cole, a ranch hand in his 50s who'd been sent to evacuate her when her heating system failed and repair proved impossible during the approaching storm. She was 74 years old and carried herself with the dignity of someone who'd survived enough to recognize when survival required accepting help. The storm announced itself through changes in air pressure and wind patterns that made experienced residents nervous hours before the first snow fell. Temperature dropped with a speed that suggested malevolence, plummeting from uncomfortable to dangerous to lethal across a span that felt deliberately compressed. Wind began with gusts that rattled walls, then settled into sustained force that made the shelter's thick construction feel less like luxury and more like necessity. Inside, 18 people plus Sarah and Emma created a density that would have felt oppressive under different circumstances, but now generated warmth that complemented the stove's radiant heat. Frank stayed to help manage the crisis, his experience and authority providing reassurance that calmed anxieties that might otherwise have spiraled toward panic. Radio contact with the authorities confirmed what everyone already understood from looking outside. Roads impassable, rescues suspended. The sheriff's office asked how many people were at the shelter, then expressed relief bordering on astonishment when Sarah reported 19 souls safe and warm. That's 19 lives saved. Document everything. The shelter's design proved its worth during those first brutal days. The central stove radiated heat that rose naturally, warming all levels without requiring forced air or electrical systems that might fail. The thick walls held a temperature steady even as outside conditions degraded past anything most guests had experienced. Conversations developed among strangers who discovered common ground through shared circumstance. Beth and Tom, the couple whose romantic plans had transformed into survival situation, told stories about early relationship mistakes. Marcus, a trucker in his 40s, described routes he'd driven and cargoes he'd hauled. Doris offered Depression-era wisdom about enduring hard times through community and mutual support, lessons that felt increasingly relevant as the storm intensified. Emma listened to everything, recording voices and stories with her phone, creating an archive of human connection that emerged when normal life got suspended by weather that recognized no authority except its own physics. Sarah watched her daughter flourish in an environment that demanded contribution, and felt something shift in her understanding of what childhood could include when adults made space for competence. On the third night, at 2 a.m, the generator failed. Electric lights died instantly, plunging the shelter into darkness broken only by the stove's glow. Lee woke immediately, trained by decades of electrical work to recognize when systems stopped functioning. He and Frank rushed outside into cold that hit like physical assault, wind driving snow with force that made visibility essentially zero, and breathing an exercise in controlled panic. The generator's fuel line had frozen despite precautions, gelled by temperatures that exceeded the equipment's rated tolerance. After 20 minutes that felt like hours, they retreated inside with faces that announced failure before words could. Fuel's gelled solid, won't start in this cold. Backup battery gives us maybe 6 hours. Then we're running on the stove alone. The announcement created ripples of fear that threatened to amplify into panic before experience and authority could contain them. Marcus spoke first, voicing concern that others shared. We're trapped without power? We're warm and safe with fire and thick walls. That's what matters. Beth's voice carried the edge of someone whose romantic adventure had transformed into something that might have consequences she'd never imagined. How do we stay warm enough? Doris answered with the calm that came from having survived worse. My grandparents lived through conditions like this with no electricity, no generators, nothing but fire and each other. It worked for them. It'll work for us. Frank took control with the authority of someone who'd managed crises before and understood that leadership mattered more during emergencies than during comfortable times. The stove alone can keep us alive if we manage it correctly. Old House did it with more people and less food. This shelter was designed using those same principles. We ration heat carefully, take shifts tending fire, sleep close together in the warmest areas. He explained protocols developed more than a century earlier. One person awake per 2-hour shift to tend the stove and monitor temperature. Sleeping arrangements concentrated on the upper level where rising heat accumulated most effectively. Blankets shared to maximize warmth through combined body heat. Firewood used sparingly, each piece chosen for density and burn time rather than immediate heat generation. Emma had been watching Frank manage the stove for days, absorbing lessons about wood selection and airflow. When he asked for volunteers for shifts, her hand went up before Sarah could object. I can do it. I've been watching. I know what to look for. Frank considered her with seriousness that acknowledged capability rather than age. Okay, you take the 8 to 10 shift. I'll be one level down if you need anything. They reorganized according to principles that Margaret had pioneered when institutional support had proven illusory and survival had depended on community willing to share warmth and ration resources. Children and elderly in the warmest positions at the center of the upper level. Stronger adults arranged around the perimeter, their bodies creating additional insulation. Sarah took the midnight to 2 shift, sitting beside the stove while others slept in arrangements that looked more like refugees than tourists. She fed wood carefully, watching flames that represented the difference between survival and catastrophe, thinking about Margaret doing this exact thing while knowing that not everyone would see spring. Temperature inside the shelter began dropping as the backup battery died, and electrical heating elements went offline. 68 degrees Fahrenheit gave way to 62, then 58, then 56. People huddled closer, conserving warmth through proximity that felt less like choice and more like physics operating according to laws that preceded comfort. The cold wasn't pleasant, but it remained survivable. Proof that Margaret's design principles transcended the century that separated her emergency from this one. Emma woke Sarah at 7:30, ready for her shift with seriousness that made Sarah's chest tighten with combined pride and fear. She watched her daughter sit beside the stove, adding wood with careful attention to burn rate and heat distribution, and understood that competence mattered more than comfort and contribution mattered more than protection. The radio crackled at 9 in the morning on day 5. Commissioner Graham's voice requesting status update with professional concern that suggested genuine worry rather than bureaucratic obligation. Shelter, this is County Emergency Services. Confirm your status. Sarah responded with information that felt simultaneously reassuring and alarming. 19 people safe and warm. Generator failed 3rd night. We're managing with the central stove using 1898 protocols. Silence stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if transmission had failed. Then Graham's voice returned, carrying an edge that hadn't been present before. You're maintaining adequate temperature with wood heat alone? 56 degrees inside, cold but survivable. The design works exactly as Margaret Mitchell intended. Another pause, then a response waited with implications Sarah didn't immediately understand. Commissioner Dalton is insisting on emergency evaluation. National Guard is transporting him and inspection team to your location within 2 hours. He's claiming structure is compromised and evacuation is necessary for safety. Frank's expression darkened with recognition of what this meant. He wants us to fail, wants to prove the shelter doesn't work, so he can shut it down permanently. The National Guard all-terrain vehicle arrived with a Dalton and 2 guardsmen, the engine noise announcing their presence long before they appeared through snow that had accumulated to depths that made walking treacherous. Dalton emerged looking like someone whose comfortable office existence hadn't prepared him for actual field conditions, frost forming on the beard he'd grown since Sarah last saw him. He entered the shelter with proprietary confidence that suggested he expected to find chaos and suffering that would justify whatever action he'd already decided to take. Instead, he found organization and warmth in people who looked uncomfortable but not endangered, gathered around a stove that provided heat without requiring the electrical systems his inspection would have deemed mandatory. Generator failure qualifies this structure as compromised. I'm ordering immediate evacuation to county emergency facilities. Sarah stepped forward, placing herself between Dalton and the people whose safety she'd accepted responsibility for. We're maintaining adequate temperature. Everyone is safe, warm, and fed. Moving them into -35 weather creates risk that staying here doesn't. The guardsman sergeant, a man in his 30s, whose bearings suggested Marine Corps training and combat deployment, examined the shelter with professional assessment that acknowledged competent emergency management when he saw it. Sir, conditions outside are genuinely lethal. Transport exposes people to sustained cold that could cause casualties. Interior temperature here is stable and adequate. Dalton's frustration manifested as tightness around his mouth and eyes. Your orders are evacuation, Sergeant? Yes, sir, but field commanders have discretion regarding implementation when circumstances suggest modification is appropriate. Emma pushed through adults who'd been watching this exchange with growing alarm, her voice carrying across space that had gone silent with tension. You want us to fail, but great-great-grandma's house won't fail because she built it right and we built this right too. Dalton's face flushed with anger that had been building since the courthouse ruling. This is not a child's fantasy. This is serious emergency management requiring adult judgment. Doris stood with the deliberate care of someone whose joints protested movement, but whose dignity demanded participation. Young man, I'm 74 years old. I've survived the Depression, 3 wars, 2 husbands, and more hard winters than you've seen mild ones. I know when I'm safe. This shelter is the safest place I've been in a week. Other voices joined hers, guests speaking over each other with the passion of people who recognized that their actual safety mattered less to Dalton than his need to prove the shelter inadequate. Marcus talked about trucking experience that taught him to recognize danger when it was real. Beth and Tom described their terror before finding the shelter and their relief after entering it. Frank stepped forward, positioning himself beside Sarah in a statement of alliance that carried weight beyond words. Sergeant, did you serve? Marines, 2 deployments. Vietnam, 1 tour. You know that orders don't always account for ground truth. The sergeant's expression shifted subtly. Acknowledgement passing between veterans who'd learned to trust their own assessment of situations where following instructions exactly could get people killed. Yeah, I do. The second guardsman, who'd been monitoring radio communications, interrupted with news that changed everything. Sir, media is broadcasting this live. Amanda Price got satellite uplink working. Dalton's face went through a series of expressions that suggested he was calculating the optics of what was happening in real time. Amanda's voice came through the radio, narrating for an audience that Dalton couldn't see but knew was watching. Commissioner Dalton is attempting to force evacuation of warm shelter into -35-degree storm conditions. 18 people, including elderly and children, are refusing to leave safety for transport that the National Guard sergeant on scene describes as genuinely dangerous. The sergeant made his decision with the kind of quiet authority that came from accepting responsibility for outcomes rather than hiding behind orders. Sir, I cannot in good conscience recommend evacuation. The shelter is maintaining adequate temperature, people are safe, and transport creates risk that remaining here doesn't. My field assessment is that they should shelter in place until conditions improve. Dalton's voice came tight with controlled fury. That's insubordination. That's field judgment based on conditions you're not qualified to assess. My report will document that evacuation would have created unnecessary risk to civilian lives, and I'm not authorizing it. Silence stretched while Dalton processed his complete defeat, the recognition that his authority had limits, and those limits had just been reached by someone whose judgment would be trusted over his own. He looked at Sarah with an expression that combined hatred and grudging acknowledgement that she'd won this particular confrontation. This doesn't end here. When conditions improve, full investigation will proceed. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. By then, everyone will understand that what we built works and that you tried to shut it down for reasons that had nothing to do with safety. He left without responding, the National Guard vehicle pulling away with exhaust that froze instantly in air cold enough to make breathing painful. The sergeant remained briefly, approaching Sarah with respect that felt earned rather than automatic. Ma'am, what you've done here matters. This shelter saved lives. I'll make sure my report says exactly that. After they left, the shelter settled into quiet that felt like collective exhale. Emma moved among guests with water and encouragement, her earlier fear transformed into confidence by having seen her mother stand against authority and refuse to yield ground. The storm broke on the seventh day, wind easing and temperature rising toward levels that felt almost warm compared to what had preceded. Snow stopped falling and sky cleared to blue, so sharp it looked artificial, revealing landscape transformed into white expanse that bore no resemblance to the empty ground they'd crossed weeks earlier. People prepared to leave with the careful attention of those who recognized they'd participated in something that transcended simple weather emergency. Doris hugged Sarah with strength that suggested decades hadn't diminished her capacity for gratitude. Your grandmother would be proud. You did what she did. You saved people when institutions couldn't. Marcus promised to tell everyone he encountered about the shelter that had made survival possible. Beth and Tom talked about bringing their future children back someday to see the place that had turned their romantic disaster into a story about human resilience. Emma recorded each departure in her logbook, preserving names and dates and brief notes about who had stayed and why they'd needed shelter. The accumulating record transformed abstract principle into concrete documentation of lives that had intersected with Margaret's legacy and survived because that legacy continued operating. Media coverage that followed shifted from regional interest to national narrative about individuals challenging systems designed to serve purposes other than public welfare. Amanda's footage of Dalton's failed evacuation attempt played repeatedly on networks that specialized in stories about government overreach. The comments and analysis varied in quality and accuracy, but the core message remained consistent. Ordinary people had built something that worked while officials had tried to stop them for reasons that had nothing to do with safety. Dalton resigned 3 weeks later under pressure from investigations that revealed financial connections to Whitmore properties and documented his family's historical attempts to seize land that Margaret's community had defended. His public statement claimed he'd acted in good faith based on genuine safety concerns, but everyone understood that his departure represented acknowledgement of defeat rather than principled retirement. Winter persisted through February with the kind of sustained cold that made early settlers' journals seem less like exaggeration and more like understatement. The shelter continued housing travelers caught by weather that punished optimism and rewarded caution. Each guest signed Emma's logbook, adding to a record that now numbered in the dozens, each name representing a life that had intersected with this place and continued, because Margaret's answer to winter remained valid across the decades. Sarah found rhythm in the work of maintaining the shelter and coordinating with Frank on improvements that compliance required. The temporary life she'd lived for 46 years had begun transforming into something that felt permanent, though she remained cautious about trusting that permanence would last. Emma enrolled in the local school after winter break, making friends with the ease of children who'd learned that new situations could be survived and sometimes even enjoyed. Spring arrived slowly, reluctantly, as though winter needed to be convinced that its season had ended. Snow melted in patches that revealed ground that looked simultaneously damaged and resilient, scarred by months of freezing but already showing signs of recovery. The ice on nearby streams cracked with sounds like gunfire, releasing water that had been locked solid since November. Official recognition came in April when temperatures had risen enough to make outdoor ceremonies feasible without risking frostbite. The designation of Margaret's house as a National Historic Site arrived with federal protection that overrode local authority and ensured preservation regardless of future political changes. The shelter received full licensing and funding allocation for maintenance and operations, transforming it from contested project into permanent institution. The ceremony took place on ground that had thawed enough to reveal grass beneath snow that had persisted for months. State officials whose presence suggested they'd never oppose the project spoke about American resilience and frontier values with the practiced insincerity of people who claimed credit for outcomes they'd actively resisted. The governor's representative praised Margaret Mitchell's vision and Sarah's determination, managing to avoid mentioning that his office had supported Dalton's attempts at closure. Sarah stood with Emma and Frank, facing a gathering that included local residents, media representatives, and some of the people who'd sheltered during the storm. The two houses rose behind them, old and new, separated by more than a century, but united by the same understanding that survival sometimes required building together what couldn't be built alone. Frank spoke when called upon, his words carrying weight that political rhetoric couldn't match. He looked directly at the old house as he began, as though speaking to ancestors rather than assembled officials. My great-grandfather Thomas Reeves died in this house more than 100 years ago. He was 23 years old. He caught pneumonia during the coldest month of a winter that killed hundreds of people across this region. But he didn't die alone in the dark. He died warm among friends in a building he'd helped construct, having contributed everything he had to a community that tried to save him even though they couldn't save everyone. His voice caught slightly, emotion breaking through the control he'd maintained. That's a good death, an honorable death. This house gave him that dignity. Margaret Mitchell gave him that dignity by building something that protected people even when protection couldn't be perfect. And now, more than a century later, this house continues giving. Not because government protected it, not because regulations preserved it, but because it was built to answer a question that winter keeps asking. And once you've given that answer, the only remaining work is maintaining it for the next person who needs to know whether survival is possible when everything else fails. He stepped back and the official speeches resumed, but Sarah barely heard them. She was looking at Emma, who was looking at the houses with an expression that suggested she understood something important about what had happened here and what it meant for who she might become. The ceremony concluded with photographs and handshakes and promises about ongoing support that Sarah knew to treat with skepticism born from experience. But the designation itself was real, documented and legally binding, federal protection that couldn't be easily undone by local officials with private grievances or development companies with profit motives. As the crowd dispersed and officials returned to vehicles that would carry them back to offices where history became paperwork, Sarah walked toward the old house with Emma beside her. They entered together, moving through the space that had been empty for so long and was now permanently protected. The growth marks on the walls, the names carved into hardened earth, the evidence of children who had measured their heights while winter tried to stop time, all of it would endure now, preserved not as museum curiosity, but as testimony to what people could achieve when institutions failed them. Emma ran her fingers over the marks, tracing the lines that documented growth and survival and loss. Do you think great-great-grandma would like what we did? Sarah considered this carefully, thinking about a woman she'd never met but felt she'd come to know through the evidence she'd left behind. Margaret Mitchell hadn't built for glory or recognition. She'd built because people needed shelter, and no one else was providing it. She'd hidden gold to protect community rather than enriching herself. She designed upward when resources limited building outward, making choices dictated by necessity rather than preference. I think she'd understand why we did it, and I think she'd approve of continuing work that she started when continuing was the only option that mattered. They stood together in the quiet of the old house, listening to wind move through gaps in the structure that had allowed it to survive by flexing rather than resisting. Outside, the new shelter stood ready for the next winter, the next storm, the next travelers who would need refuge when weather turned lethal and distance stretched too far. Frank appeared in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by afternoon sun that had finally gained enough strength to feel warm. People are asking if you'll give tours. Want to tell Margaret's story to visitors who'll come now that it's official. Sarah looked around at the space that had transformed from abstract inheritance into concrete responsibility, from distant history into immediate present. Emma should do it. She knows the story better than anyone. She documented everything. Let her tell people what this place means. Emma's face showed surprise and pride in equal measure. Really? Really? You're the one who kept the logbook. You recorded everyone who stayed. You understand what great-great-grandma built Because you helped build it again. Frank nodded approval. Smart kid telling the story of a smart woman. That works. They walked outside together, the three of them, plus a few lingering guests who'd stayed to explore the houses more thoroughly. The afternoon light caught the structures at an angle that emphasized their vertical lines, making them look even taller and more improbable than usual. Sarah stood between the old house and the new shelter, feeling the weight of custodianship settle alongside the satisfaction of knowing that some things endured, because people chose to make them endure. Winter would return. It always did in this region, arriving early and departing late, testing everything that claimed permanence. But the houses would stand ready, answering the same question they'd been built to answer, proving that Margaret's vision remained viable across whatever span of time separated her emergency from the next crisis that would demand shelter and warmth, and the willingness to share both with strangers who became community through the simple fact of shared survival. Emma took Sarah's hand, squeezing once before letting go and running toward a group of visitors who wanted to see the growth marks inside. Frank stood beside Sarah, both of them watching the girl who'd traveled from Ohio on a desperate gamble and found purpose in a place that had been waiting more than a century to be rediscovered. You staying? Frank's question carried no pressure, just curiosity about plans that Sarah was still forming. Sarah thought about the apartment she'd left behind, the temporary life she'd lived for decades, the pattern of moving before attachment could form. She thought about Emma signing her name in the logbook alongside the travelers who'd sheltered during the storm, becoming part of a record that would outlast them both. Margaret didn't build this to last forever. She built it to last long enough for people to survive winter, long enough to prove that community mattered. I think we've proven the same thing. So yes, I'm staying, for as long as it takes. Frank nodded, no surprise in his expression, just acknowledgement of a decision that probably felt inevitable to everyone except Sarah herself. The sun continued its arc toward evening, throwing long shadows across ground that was finally releasing its grip on winter. In a few months, snow would return and the cycle would begin again, temperature dropping and wind rising and travelers finding themselves caught between destinations with darkness falling and cold intensifying. But the shelter would be ready, door unlocked and fire lit, maintaining the answer that Margaret had given when asked whether survival was possible when institutions failed and weather turned merciless. The answer remained the same as it had always been. Yes, but only if you build what's necessary and defend it against those who value procedure over people. Yes, but only if you understand that some things matter enough to fight for even when fighting seems impossible. Yes, but only if you're willing to trust that what you build might outlast you, serving purposes you can't predict for people you'll never meet. Sarah turned back toward the houses one final time before following Emma inside, seeing them not as buildings but as testimony, not as property, but as proof that ordinary people could create extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it and courage permitted it. The temporary life had ended. What came next remained uncertain in its details but clear in its direction. She had found something worth defending, and defense required presence rather than flight. The door closed behind her with the solid sound of wood meeting wood, sealing warmth inside against cold that would inevitably return. But for now, in this moment, spring had arrived and winter had retreated, and the houses stood ready for whatever came next, maintained by people who understood that the best inheritance wasn't wealth or property, but the knowledge of how to answer when necessity called and institutions proved inadequate. Emma's voice echoed from the upper level, already beginning the tour she would give hundreds of times in years to come, telling Margaret's story to people who needed to hear that survival was possible and community mattered, and some things endured because people made them endure through nothing more complicated than showing up and doing what needed to be done.